Hello, welcome to another Essential Writing Tools video. My name is Jonathan, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about tuning your voice. So voice is arguably the most important concept you should know as a writer. Voice is the sum of all the strategies that the writer uses to create the illusion that he or she is speaking to the reader from the page. Voice is an effect that is created by the writer that reaches the reader through his ears, even though he or she is reading it through the eyes, obviously, because that's how you read. One of the most interesting ways I have seen reading described is you basically look at a piece of wood and start hallucinating vividly. I've always found, to me it's always been really funny how true this statement is, but it also brings home the point how vital the responsibility that we as writers have to convey a message accurately to the reader. Writers have just a responsibility to write well. Now, writing well is obviously subjective, and even on an objective level, I myself have still a lot to learn, but it's a journey that takes time, and it's a process that maybe we can take together. Later, it was said that a man came from the north, from Roper's Gate. He came on foot, leading his laden horse by the bridle. It was late afternoon, and the ropers, saddlers, and tanners' stalls were already closed, the street empty. It was hot, but the man had a black coat thrown over his shoulders. He drew attention to himself. He stopped in front of old Naruko Inn, stood there for a moment, listened to the hubbub of voices. As usual at this hour, it was full of people. The stranger did not enter old Naruko. He pulled his horse farther down the street to another tavern, a smaller one called the Fox. Not enjoying the best of reputations, it was almost empty. The innkeeper raised his head above the barrel of pickled cucumbers and measured the man with his gaze. The outsider, still in his coat, stood stiffly in front of the counter, motionless and silent. "What'll it be?" "Beer," said the stranger. His voice was unpleasant. The innkeeper wiped his hands on canvas apron and filled a chipped earthenware tankard. The stranger was not old, but his hair was almost entirely white. Beneath his coat he wore a worn leather jerkin, laced up at the neck and shoulders. As he took off his coat, those around him noticed that he carried a sword. Not something unusual in itself. Nearly every man in Wyzim carried a weapon, but no one carried a sword strapped to his back as if it were a bow or quiver. The stranger did not sit at the table with a few other guests. He remained standing at the counter, piercing the innkeeper with a gaze. He drew from the tankard. "I'm looking for a room for the night." "There's none," grunted the innkeeper, looking at the guest boots, dusty and dirty. "Ask at the old Naruko. I would rather stay here." "There is none." The innkeepers finally recognized the stranger's accent. He was Rivian. "I'll pay." The outsider spoke quietly as if unsure, and the whole nasty affair began. A pock-marked beanpole of a man who, from the moment the outsider had entered, had not taken his gloomy eyes from him, got up and approached the counter. Two of his companions rose behind him, no more than 2 paces away. "There's no room to be had, you Rivian vagabond," rasped the pock-marked man, standing right next to the outsider. "We don't need people like you in Wyzim. This is a decent town." He knocked the tankard from the stranger's hand and, simultaneously grabbing him by the shoulder, dug his fingers into the leather strap which ran diagonally across the outsider's chest. One of the men behind him raised his fist to strike. The outsider curled up on the spot, throwing the pock-marked man off balance. The sword hissed in his sheath and glistened briefly in the dim light. The place seethed. There was a scream, and one of the few remaining customers tumbled toward the exit. A chair fell with a crash, and earthenware smacked hollowly against the floor. The innkeeper, his lips trembling, looked at the horribly slashed face of the pocked man who, clinging with fingers to the edge of his counter, was slowly sinking from sight. The other two were lying on the floor, one motionless and the other writhing and convulsing in a dark, spreading puddle. A woman's hysterical scream vibrated in the air, piercing the ears as the innkeeper shuddered, caught his breath, and vomited. The stranger retreated toward the wall, tense and alert. He held his sword in both hands, sweeping the blade through the air. No one moved. Terror, like cold mud, was clear on their faces, paralyzing limbs and blocking throats. So that was just a little excerpt from one of my favorite novels, The Last Wish by Andrzej Sapkowski. It is it's kind of like a dark fantasy story. It's a collection of short stories written by this Polish author, Andrzej Sapkowski. And again, this is one of my favorite books. If you're interested at all in reading this, I highly recommend this to any fantasy lovers out there. It is definitely worth your time and money. Link in the description down below. So I really appreciate Andrzej Sapkowski's voice because for me it's one of the styles that I want to emulate the most because there's a good balance between dialogue and description. Now the description is very stylized. By stylized I mean that Andrzej Sapkowski uses descriptors masterfully, definitely showcases a skillful use of imagery. And not only that, the dialogue that he has his characters speak is not excessive. It very much complements the story, and it's very thematic too. You can remember a lot of the lines that they have are very much quotable. You know, one of the most quotable lines in all of the whole series is Geralt of Rivia's line saying, "If I have to choose between an evil and a lesser evil, I'd rather not choose at all." Definitely one of my favorite quotes of the book. Okay, so you're trying to figure out what your voice is when you're writing. So you just have to ask yourself the question, what makes up the body of voice? What is the level of language? Is it an 8th grader level of language, or above that, more like a college style language? It really depends on your target audience. Who is it that you're trying to appeal to? Are you writing a children's book? Well, you probably wouldn't use harder words, like longer words, more descriptive words. You'd pretty much dumb down your language so that they can understand. Or is it college level where you would have to use, well, you don't have to, but it would be more to your benefit to breed credibility in your readers to improve your language. Another aspect of voice is what person do you work in? And by that I mean, do you use I? Do you use we? Do you use third person, first person, there's third person limited? What person do you use when you write? Next, what are your ranges and sources of illusion? Is it more of a simplistic kind of illusion where it's more like a street cobbler or coal miner, the way they kind of speak, or is it more of a theologian or a philosopher? The way they would speak, you know, what aspect are you coming from that you're trying to describe certain concepts, certain ideologies? Or are you even trying to do them at all? Some people don't even bother with ideologies. They'd rather let the reader develop their own ideologies and you just write the content instead. You know, there is that kind of writing too. How often does the writer use metaphors and figures of speech? Do you want to sound more like a poet using colorful descriptors and elaborate figures of speech, or more like a journalist, very specific, using them only for special effects? What is the length and structure of a typical sentence? Is it short, simple, or is it more descriptive, long, with using a lot of commas? That also has to do with your paragraph lengths, how you put your paragraphs in order, and then how often you have dialogue coming in between those paragraphs. That's basically voice. It's just the layering of all those things. And what is the distance from neutrality? Is the writer trying to be objective, partisan, or passionate? The last question to consider is how the writer frames his or her material. Is he or she beat, offbeat? Does the writer work with standard subject matter using conventional storytelling forms, or is the writer more of a experimental kind of writer, just completely stepping the bar, completely changing the way things are normally spoken or normally written in this case? Pelting rains greeted Elamaya and drenched her to the bone as she walked through the muddy brick streets. Empty house after house stared at her gloomily as Elamaya passed the windows and doorways. She huddled into her cloak and pulled the hood over her head. Elamaya glanced at the skies as she walked through muddy alleyways. The moon was slightly visible through the clouds, giving her a little bit of light as to direct herself to the streets of Yorveth. From the corner of her eye she caught a shadow moving behind her, but when she turned to look, the shadow disappeared into the darkness. The shadow reappeared in her mind's eye, and she could hear the splashing of its feet on puddles behind her. Elamaya glanced back, and this time the shadow did not disappear. Instead, there were 3 shadows behind her. They looked like swordsmen, but their outlines were blurred like a black fog. It was a demon. Elamaya turned and shot down the street, her boots rapping the brick street as she ran. She stepped into a puddle of water and ran into an alleyway, careful not to slip. The shadows followed closely at her heels. She could hear their footfalls catching up to her. Elamaya unfastened her wet cloak. The heavy cloth fell into the street, giving Elamaya a little more momentum. Her breaths were labored, but without her armor she was faster and stronger. Even being chased as she was, Elamaya herself was a weapon. She allowed herself to smile. The shadows seemed to be falling behind as she plowed through the streets. Her muscles burned in her arms and chest, but it didn't feel wrong. She was fierce and built to fight. Even the pain in her chest disappeared as she charged through the streets and alleyways. So that was just an excerpt from my novel, Knights Without Kings. So, which by the way you can purchase at Amazon. It's available on paperback and Kindle. So yeah, shameless plug. So basically what I just read to you, I'm just trying to describe to you what my voice sounds like in my writing. You know, the length of the sentences, the description that I use. I'm trying to go for a more, just obviously, my imagery, I want it to be very much colorful. I want to place my readers into the setting that the character is in. I want them to see, basically be a fly on the wall. And obviously I think that every writer wants that. it wants their readers to just engage with the characters that are written on paper and want them to just become a part of them, right? In this way, I hope to have achieved my goal of making the reader a part of the story. Getting students to unlearn what they think they know, to erase habits. The old man took a dainty sip, even though his drink no longer steamed. You see, everyone is born with questions. Arcadius held up his mug. Empty cups are too eager to be filled with anything that comes by, even if it's nonsense. For example, what color is this table? Brown. How do you know that? Well, I can see it. But can you describe the color without using a reference? How could you, for example, explain the color blue to a person blind from birth? Hadrian considered saying it was cool or tranquil, like the sky or water, but none really defined blue. Arcadius's robe was blue, and it was none of those things. You can't, the professor said at length. We only know colors by relationships. Your father likely pointed to hundreds of objects whose only common feature was the color, and eventually you understood that the commonality of color equaled the word he used. A lot of things are that way, abstract ideas that have no object to define them, right and wrong, for example. Problems tend to occur when people are eager to fill their cups and accept ideas by those who might be, metaphorically, colorblind. Once an idea is learned, once it settles in, it becomes comfortable and hard to discard, like an old hat. And trust me, I have many old hats. Some I haven't worn in years, but I still keep them. Emotion gets in the way of practicality. By virtue of time spent, even ideas become old friends, and if you can't bear to lose an old hat that you never wear, imagine how much harder it is to abandon ideas you grew up with. The longer the relationship, the harder it is. This is why I try to get them young before their minds petrify with nonsense they learn out there in the colorblind world. I'm not always successful. He stared at the older boy seated across from them and winked, causing the boy to scowl and turn away. That was an excerpt from The Crown Tower by Michael J. Sullivan. Also an excellent book. I highly recommend this if you're a fantasy fan, which I certainly am. So link in the description down below if you want to get that. So his voice, at least in this particular excerpt that I read to you, was mostly dialogue. But how did the author handle this character speaking that dialogue? It really defines the character, because this character is the only one in the entire book who would speak that way, using more elevated principles of philosophy and even of language. So that really describes that character as the professor, obviously, since that's one of his names, one of his titles is professor. So in this video, I challenge you to test your voice. And the best way to test your writing voice is to read your work out loud. So try reading your story out loud and see if you can find problems in the text. And maybe that way you can find your voice. Now, for me, when writing Knights Without Kings, I really didn't do this early on. And I feel like a lot of my work was hampered because of it. You know, especially now in retrospect, seeing like, wow, I really could have changed this to make it sound a little bit better. I'm definitely not making that mistake with the Twin Princes. Or Aberwal. I'm trying to, once it's done through the beta editing process, I'm going to take a step back and then I'm going to read it out loud. And out loud, like, doesn't mean look at the page and mouth the words. It means really speak it. You want to hear your voice come out as you read these words. And then hopefully like that, you'll be able to fine tune a little bit kind of your descriptions, the language that you're going for. So that's it for this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you learned anything about it, or maybe had a little bit of insight as to how to improve your writing, leave a like, maybe subscribe. As a final note, I'm getting most of my ideas from the Essential Writing Tools by Roy Peter Clark. So I don't want to be taking credit for his work. This is his work, and I'm just making videos on it, trying to make it accessible to other people who don't have this book. But if you'd like to purchase this book, there's going to be a link down in the description as well. I have a Facebook that I'm really active on, and so go ahead and there's going to be a link down in the description. And again, feel free to check out Knights Without Kings, and feel free to give a review of it as well. If you read the book and you like what you see, you know, let me know. And if you don't, you can also feel free to let me know too. Yeah, you know, it's fair either way. All right, and I'll see you guys on the next time. All right, you be safe out there. Bye. Deep inside, you know there must be more. You cannot miss what you have never seen before.